Hello, welcome to the overview of this chapter on international trade with Mr. Rodman. Here to take you through it. I hope you find this helpful. Obviously, this does not replace the textbook, the Krugman text, but is a supplement to that material, and I hope you will check it out. In this chapter, if you're in the online version on Canvas, that would be chapter 18. If you're in the hard copy text, that would be chapter 17, and this is international trade. So you remember from the first few chapters, in looking at the basics of supply and demand, wants, needs, all that good stuff, from the basics of economics. We're looking in this chapter at going further with comparative advantage, looking at that in terms of how countries compare their comparative advantages and source that comparative advantage. We look at the impact of trade and what tariffs and quotas and other trade restrictions may do, and what impact it has on efficiency and the market. So let's jump right in, looking at international trade and these aspects. So it's important to keep in mind that when we're looking at this, macro is really, I always tell students, it's like getting in a plane, going up 3,000 feet into the air or 10,000 feet, and then looking out the window and seeing the land mass that is where you just came from. And that essentially is the macro view of the economy. So in micro, we looked at individual business decisions, individual consumer decision-making aspects. And in this chapter, or in this semester, we're actually looking at the macro view. So we're looking at how all of those consumer decisions and business decisions add up to a much broader decision-making process and the impact of that that is taking place across the country. And country by country, they tabulate and calculate these types of things, looking for where they have their comparative advantage and where there are gains from trade. Now, obviously, we're going to look at countries in terms of that gain from trade. And there have to be significant gains from trade in order for countries to be able to trade with one another. So that's important to keep in mind as a baseline. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing so. But they're going to be looking at where are their comparative advantages, where are their distinct advantages for their country to maintain that trade, and without that beneficial aspect of gains from trade, it really does diminish the value of trade and is not really what we're covering. Remember, the whole idea of economic decision making is that people, and countries included here, are making rational decisions and acting in their own best self-interest, but there are gains from those decisions that they're making. And that is important as we keep that in mind here in this chapter. Now, the opportunity cost essentially is looking for where is it that I'm going to produce a product and trade with another country at a cheaper cost than they would in producing that product. So where is it that I have a lower cost in producing that good than another country does? That's the comparative advantage. So if you remember in micro, or even in the previous chapters, the highlights we went through, you'll keep in mind that we looked at, where individuals had gains from trade, where they had the lower opportunity cost in producing two goods. The one good that had a lower opportunity cost had the comparative advantage. And the same is true here. The difference is instead of consumers or businesses, we're looking at countries. And again, think you're up in the plane looking out the window, and the giant landmass is the economy as a whole, and that is what we're looking at for the opportunity costs in terms of trade. And that is beneficial to both countries, that they have something that they can produce at a lower opportunity cost, and that you can as well, and there are gains from trade in both of those. And we'll take a look at a couple of graphs here in a moment where that will better align with what we're talking about. All right, it's important to note production possibilities. Don't forget the basics of what we've talked about. Where do you have advantages in terms of what you can produce? Absolute advantage says that we can produce better than any other country. We can produce more of it than any other country. And in this model, in the Ricardian model, the idea is, think it's a straight line. Again, not always a typical situation, but a straight line in terms of if you're not producing one product, you'd be producing another. And autarky is actually where we're not trading with anyone. We're just trading within our own country. It's very hard to find a country today in which that is the case, but that is autarky, and you're going to hear that concept used a lot. in terms of in terms of macroeconomic points of view, because countries that don't trade in a particular product are essentially operating in autarky, and it's hard to believe that there is no lower opportunity cost, no comparative advantage for that country to trade with another. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, as I mentioned, it's important to look here at the model of that Ricardian production possibilities model. This is looking at two countries, the United States and Colombia. And in this model, we can see that it is beneficial just based on the slope, the slant of the curve. It is better for the United States to produce computers because the slope favors computers and not roses. They can produce 2,000 computers. They can only produce 1,000 roses. And then for the Colombian government, looking at computers versus roses, it is better for them to produce roses because they can produce 2,000 in the time it takes them to produce only 1,000 computers. So again, and this is specific to trading with the United States, Colombia has a comparative advantage in producing roses, and the United States has a comparative advantage in producing computers. Now we can do that whole output other over thing, from chapter 2, and look at calculating the comparative advantage, but we can also look here at the model and see that the slope is favoring the country of the comparative advantage of the product that they should be producing. So in this model, for the U.S., it's computers. For Colombia, it's roses. And then it's important to note where they would consume in terms of their trade with this other country. Because remember, you can't produce beyond your production possibilities, but you can consume beyond it. And if you note here where it says C.US or C1, I think, and then it has U.S. consumption with trade, notice that the United States can consume more in flowers than they can produce, right? They can consume more in computers than they produce if they're producing both in autarky. But the idea is they can't produce beyond it. So they can consume beyond it though, and they are in this model at C1 or C apostrophe, whatever that is, and essentially shows us that they can consume beyond their production possibilities, even though they can't produce beyond it. And the same is true for Colombia. Look over here at C1CO. They can consume more roses and computers than they could produce along the line, but they can consume beyond it, but they can't produce beyond it. And that's the important point here: is there has to be a gain from trade, but there also is huge benefits to consumption because obviously we can consume more when we trade than when we're in autarky. And that really is the point of bringing autarky up here. If we were just producing in autarky, you could see what we would be able to produce: 2,000 computers for the U.S., 1,000 roses for the U.S., or 1,000 computers for Colombia and 2,000 roses for Colombia if they were in autarky. But by having trade between the two countries, they're able to consume beyond those production possibilities. They can't produce beyond it, but they can consume beyond it, and we see that here at those coordinates that I mentioned. And hopefully that makes a little more sense in the visual in those terms. All right, a couple of other things when we look at comparative advantage by country that is a little different that we didn't really talk about in the chapters in micro on comparative advantage, and that is there are some advantages where the sources of comparative advantage, where these advantages come from, these benefits. One of them is climate. There are some countries that are just better at growing crops because of where they are located in the world, closer to the equator or whatever. And so they have an international difference in that respect. Technology, maybe they put a lot into human capital. South Korea, a great example of this. They put a lot into their human capital, and with it, they're able to produce all kinds of technological advances and developments, and LG and Samsung being two very great ones in terms of their technological advances. So that allowed them to have a comparative advantage. Again, it does come from the fact that they invested human capital. They invested money and resources and time and energy into that human capital in order to have that comparative advantage. Not all countries can or do take that and make that decision to invest in those areas, but that is definitely a source of comparative advantage. And then factor endowments. This is the idea that you are just sitting on top of a giant pond of oil. In some place like Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or Venezuela. And so you have factor endowments that benefit you because of where you're located and because of the resources you have. We've heard a lot in the news lately about countries and mineral rights. Ukraine, for example, signing a deal with the United States on mineral rights. They have factor endowments, those resources that are beneath the earth or need to be mined in order to do so. But those are factor endowments that give them some sources of comparative advantage. And that's what we're talking about here. Those can definitely help in terms of in terms of trying to address the sources of comparative advantage and where they come from. Now, the Heckscher-Ohlin model you'll see mentioned here as part of factor endowments. I want to go into a little more detail on that one because it basically says, you have these resources, but how hard is it to actually get it out of the ground? How hard is it to actually bring it to market? There's going to be a lot of equipment, a lot of capital resources, very capital intensive resources that are needed in order to pull that oil out of the ground or in order to mine those minerals. And so this refers to the factor intensity that is used to produce these goods. And oil is a great example of this. I think the minerals in Ukraine, probably a good one right now, just because we've heard so much about it. Even the oil in Venezuela, with everything that's going on in Venezuela, I think is another model. You're seeing a lot of companies like ExxonMobil that say that Venezuela is uninvestable. And they don't mean that in that they're not sitting on, giant pockets of oil. But in terms of other factors, it's the capital intensity to try and pull those things out of the ground is much more expensive than in other places. And that's why they're looking at that and calling it uninvestable. So it's not saying that the oil is no good. It's saying that to get that oil to market, in their country versus in another country, it's just so much more expensive right now. And the political climate weighs in on that. We're not going to get to that until Unit 5 and Unit 6, but the political climate, how stable is the government, has an impact too, because if it's going to be expensive and you're running the risk of the government coming in and taking over your industry and basically all of the investments you've made, that can be a factor that companies say, no, I'm not interested in investing there at this time because of that. So that's an important factor to keep in mind too. All right. So you may remember key graph 5, this idea of our competition model, perfect competition model, looking at upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, supply to the sky, demand to the sand, and the idea that the domestic demand curve is going to be that upward sloping curve. Domestic demand is the downward sloping curve. Domestic supply is going to be the upward sloping curve, and the same is true for international trade. Trade is supply to the sky, demand to the sand. We're going to see the exact same things we saw in the key graph 5 model here. But the idea is that we're going to use it when it comes to what are the benefits of trade in this respect? How are we going to pull this stuff out of the ground? And imports is a great example. So if you are producing an autarky and you're just selling within your country, then there probably aren't going to be a lot of benefits to trade if you're liking the results of that trade. But if you're finding that there are gains to trade by trading with other countries that have the endowments that you don't, climate, for instance, the Chilean grapes example, then that is going to be beneficial for your country to trade with them and to find a product, maybe it's not oil, maybe it's something else, that you can produce at a lower opportunity cost and trade with that country in order to get those Chilean grapes. And that's the point of world trade, is the idea that there are benefits to that trade. We see this graph again. I kind of mentioned it here with the roses and the computers from the US and Colombia, but this is key graph 14, the idea of comparative advantage. And again, we can look at this pretty easily and see the slope in product 1, or excuse me, in country A favors product 1. In country B favors product 2 because the slope is leaning towards those countries. And therefore, that is an easy way for us to determine that that is the comparative advantage. Now, it's not always quite that simple. It may look a little trickier in other models, but the idea is that you can eyeball it looking at the slope. If you can't, then you need to go back to chapter 2 and look at comparative advantage, the IOU and the OOU method. Input other under, output other over, and then calculate the country with the lower opportunity cost has a comparative advantage. I've got a great video on that, specifically on comparative advantage, that is linked in Canvas in the modules. So do check that out if you need a refresher or you need a deeper dive into that topic on calculating comparative advantage. I go into all of that in chapter 2, but I also have a separate video from chapter 2 just on that topic of calculating comparative advantage. So that's key graph 14 pretty much, and we can see everything is labeled as it should be. It is detailed, it is neat, it is accurate, it is precise, exactly the way your graphing notebooks should be. And it's labeled country A and country B. You need that there. I need to be able to know the difference between the two countries. How are you differentiating them? And then product 1 and product 2. How are you differentiating those? So everything is labeled. Everything is using a ruler. The only thing I could say here that we could probably improve upon is adding color, right? And adding some color there. Maybe the slopes are in a different color than the axes, something along those lines. And that leads us to key graph 15, which is another model that if you had micro, you may be familiar with. This is the idea of consumer and producer surplus. You will notice here that consumer surplus is everything above the equilibrium, all the way up to the demand curve. And then from equilibrium down to the supply curve is producer surplus. What this surplus means is that it is a willingness to buy or sell, in the case of a producer, at different prices, but you don't have to because you're buying at equilibrium. You're buying at that price, P1, and quantity, Q1, at which you have an equilibrium between buyer and seller. Consumer and producer have agreed on a price and a quantity at which that price is sold. And even though you may be willing to sell it for less, producer, or even though you may be willing to buy it for more, consumer, you don't have to. You can buy at the price and quantity at this equilibrium. And that is the point of key graph 15. Now, this is also the basis, kind of the foundation for the other graphs you're going to see in this chapter. So keep that in mind because we'll be going back to this saying, okay, starting with key graph 15, what's changed? What's changed from here? And that's where it's important to take a closer look. Okay. All right. So if we look at key graph 15 in this model, you see the same thing, consumer surplus above equilibrium, the price at autarky, the quantity at autarky. Consumer surplus is everything above that price at autarky all the way up to the demand curve. And then producer surplus is everything from the price at autarky down to the supply curve. And all of this is total surplus. Consumer plus producer equals total surplus. So this is in autarky. This is when you're just trading within your own country. You haven't conducted any trade yet. We're going to do that in the next slide. But the idea is you haven't conducted any trade yet. You are buying and selling and producing all within your own country. So now it's important. I mean, this chapter is on international trade. So now let's take a closer look at what happens when we trade in other countries. And we've got a couple of different models. We're going to use cars as this example because Krugman does. And notice the autarky price is higher than the world price. Think of cars coming in from other countries. Like Japan or China, and the prices of those cars is cheaper. So notice the PW stands for the price at the world price, and PA is the autarky price. And notice where we were in key graph 15, we were right here. Point A was our equilibrium. But now with the price being lower, we have a greater domestic demand because the price is cheaper. So quantity demanded increases to this CT that we see here. And then we've got the supply of domestic supply, keep in mind, supply of those resources actually shrinks. It's actually smaller because domestic suppliers can't sell for that lower price. So they want to sell less because when the price falls, quantity supplied falls. Quantity demanded increases, but the quantity supplied is going to shrink, leaving us with a shortage. and that shortage is going to be filled by imports. If there's no regulation by the government to minimize that importation, which we know there is, and we're going to talk all about those in a minute, that leads us to filling this gap from QT to CT with imports. And that's going to be the quantity that is going to be brought in from other countries. So when the world price is lower than the price at autarky, then you're going to import. And you're going to import the gap between QT and CT. That is essentially what happens when the world price is lower. And what happens to surplus? Let's talk about that. So world price is also lower, same graph, only difference here is it's shaded, showing us the consumer surplus, which is kind of the bluish purple. Notice the consumer surplus increases. When we were at the price at autarky, W was the only consumer surplus we had. X and Y was producer surplus. But when the world price came on the market and we started trading with other countries and the price fell, and in this model, they're using roses. I was using cars because the picture in the last one. But the same is true. It doesn't matter which product we're talking about. The idea here is that the consumer surplus is going to increase when the price falls. But the producer surplus is going to decrease because while we have added part Z to all of this consumer surplus, the producer surplus that was X and Y is now only Y. And that is significant because it is reducing the producer surplus, the ability to sell at lower prices in the domestic market, domestic supply, because they're all these cars are coming in as imports from other places, which means consumers are going to want to buy at that lower price, and they're probably going to buy those imported cars and less of yours. Less of your autarky cars made in your country. And so that's going to be a significant challenge for the domestic producers. And that leads us to this key graph 16. Same is true here. You can read all the details. You can pause this here if you want more time to go through it. You definitely should graph it out into your key graphs in your graphing notebook. But notice we start with just shape number 1, which is that yellow consumer surplus. But when the world price falls, when we open from autarky to global trade, notice 2, 4, and 5 become part of consumer surplus. So now the consumer surplus is 1, 2, 4, and 5. And the producer surplus that started with 2 and 3 now is just 3 because of the world price being lower than the autarky price in that respect. Okay, so what does this tell us about imports? Well, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us that there are gains from trade. It tells us that the idea of imports is that hopefully you're going to find another product that you can export, that you're going to have a comparative advantage at a lower opportunity cost to trade with another country and make more money. And so there has to be a gain from trade from both countries in order to participate in this exchange of trade. But not all models, again, are going to have a world price that is lower than the autarky price. And that's important to keep in mind because, again, if there's a gain from trade and you're losing in the car market like we did in the last model, you're going to have to gain it somewhere else. And so that's what we're going to look at next, which is the idea of importing or exporting computers. So the model, the key graph that we used earlier talked about computers and roses. And this here is about us, the United States, exporting computers to other places of the world. And so notice the world price is higher than at autarky price. We can make it and sell it within our nation for a lower price, but on the world price, on the world stage, we can actually sell it for a higher price. Therefore, we're going to export a lot more. Why? Because the domestic supply is going to increase when the price goes up. As we know, law of supply tells us when the price goes up, the quantity supplied increases. And when the price goes down, quantity supplied decreases. And so in this model, we're going to see the domestic supply increase in terms of production, but we're not going to sell it within our country because, as you'll notice, the quantity demanded domestically is actually going to fall. It's actually going to fall to CT at PW right here. In that model. And so all of a sudden we've now got this gap where we're producing a lot more than we were at autarky, but the demand domestically is much smaller. So we've got all of this surplus of resources. And what are we going to do with it? We're going to send it out of the country. We're going to sell it to other countries and make a profit from it. And that is where we're going to gain from that trade. And let's take a look at that model. So producers are going to benefit significantly in this model because notice with the world price being higher than at autarky, we've expanded producer surplus to an additional Z area. We're taking up part of X, which was part of consumer surplus, and now producer surplus is X, Y, and Z. Producer surplus is larger as a result of that. And notice consumer surplus is actually smaller because of that higher price on the world stage. So now people domestically don't want to buy it. It's people globally or internationally that do. And so we're going to export a lot more of those goods and sell a lot fewer of them to people here in our own country. So W is the result of that. So what was WX in the original consumer surplus is now just W. In that model, we lost X. And that is significant because, as we see in this model, now that the world price is higher, this is where we're balancing that seesaw. We saw in the earlier graph when we imported cars, we were at a disadvantage because our cars were more expensive to make. But here, computers are more expensive to make in other countries. And so they're selling them and exporting them to other countries. And that leads to key graph 17, which is this idea of having a consumer surplus that is shrinking, going from 1 and 2 to just 1. And a producer surplus that is just 3 going to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 as a result of it. And that's key graph 17. You can pause it here if you want to draw the graph and jot that down. It's also in the chapter slides or the chapter notes that are also on Canvas. There is a key graphs slide deck that is just on key graphs you can find in the modules, as well as a video of me narrating all of those key graphs for you if you need more information, kind of a deeper dive on that. All of those you can find under the key graphs module on the Canvas site for macro. All right, so notice we've had a lot of talk about gains from trade, whether we're buying something that is cheaper from another country or we're selling it to another country where we're actually making a bigger profit. There has to be a gain from trade there. But sometimes we're finding that other countries are eating our lunch, that we're actually struggling to find a gain from trade with products that we can sell to them because we're buying so many others at cheaper prices and we're importing them. And this leads to a trade deficit. A trade deficit is essentially when one country is essentially buying more of those goods at cheaper prices, but the other country, unfortunately, it doesn't gain from as much of that trade as the other does. And so that creates a trade deficit. And so there's a lot of politics around this piece in terms of trade protections to put in place, things that we're going to talk about like tariffs and quotas, and the model. Now, there are a lot of economists, and most economists out there will advocate for free trade. But there are a lot of models in politics today where, and again, we're not going to be political, but where the trade protections are meant to help industries within your domestic market. And the reason for that is to help them change and adapt, and it's not meant to be a long-term fix. It's meant to be a short-term one to help them kind of get on their feet and figure out what they're going to do and change, or they will find their way to bankruptcy if they don't. And so there's a lot of models that we could talk about here. We're going to focus in on tariffs and quotas, quantity controls, as really the two. And a tariff is essentially a tax, and what we're doing is taxing those imports that are coming in. And by taxing those imports, you may know that the Trump administration has a lot of tariffs on other countries right now from those products coming in. And one of the reasons is because they are cheaper to make in a lot of other countries in terms of some of the stuff that we buy. And so this has been the model to try and right-size that gap between the domestic producers and the international ones. And some of that has led international producers to develop manufacturing facilities here in our own country so that you can kind of produce more here without the tariff. And benefit by creating jobs here in our home country without having to import a bunch of goods at cheaper prices, benefiting the country that is doing the exporting in that that model. And so a tariff is meant to kind of bridge that gap. And you're like, what does that look like? Well, when in doubt, we graph it out. And here we can see that a tariff essentially is putting a tax on that world price, raising the price of those goods to a higher price that helps. It doesn't notice it doesn't go back to autarky. It does not go back to equilibrium at autarky. And that is one important point I want to mention because it does not solve this problem. It only bridges the gap of this problem to buy time and allow time for industries to adapt, to change, to reinvent themselves and figure out what's next. So it doesn't go back to equilibrium, and that's an important point when you draw it, that you don't bring the tariff back to equilibrium entirely. But it is meant to help bridge that gap, because notice the domestic demand is going to be smaller than it was at the international price that we see here on this graph. The international price, domestic demand, is much greater. With a tax imposed, the international price is going to be higher because of the tariff. So it is going to reduce the quantity demanded of domestic demand, but it's also going to increase the amount of domestic supply. It's going to shrink that trade deficit that we talked about. And that can still be bridged with imports, but the idea is there are going to be fewer of them because of the tax. So there are going to be people that don't participate in this market, so it is inefficient, right? It does create an inefficiency in that there are products that don't get sold, that don't get made or produced because of the tariff. But the idea is it's trying to bridge the gap to buy time for the domestic industries to be able to adapt. And that's essentially what we see in this tariff model. So notice here that we, with the price of the world market at PW, notice our consumer surplus was all of this triangle, all the way up to the domestic demand, all the way down to PW. But with the tax imposed, we've got a couple things going on. One, we've added to the producer surplus because the higher price is benefiting the quantity that's being produced domestically. And so there's additional surplus there for producers. It is shrinking consumer surplus considerably because A, B, C, and D are now not a part of consumer surplus that were at the world price. Government revenue is creeping in because Part C is the imports, and those are the ones that are taxed at that higher price. And then you have a deadweight loss, essentially, B and D, that are gone because of the fact that they're not being produced at those places and being sold. So you have a change in total surplus that is losing B and D as a result of that loss, as a result of that tariff being imposed. So there are goods that aren't being produced. There are goods that are being produced domestically and being sold. But the idea is, in order to compete, but the idea is that there is a level of inefficiency that is taking place here in this market. And then we see that in this key graph 18. So this is when we have tariffs, C and D essentially being the tariff boxes, B and E being the deadweight loss. And the idea is that C and D is not deadweight loss. It is a part of government taxes, so that is government revenue. The idea of that, and you may know this from the Trump administration, is that then they try and give that to the producers that are being impacted by this tariff. So you may remember tariffs being imposed. A lot of farmers were losing contracts from governments in China that were not signing contracts for corn and soybeans and wheat anymore, because of the tariffs that were being imposed on their country's products. And so as a result of that, the Trump administration has been doling out subsidies to a lot of the farming industry and others, significant numbers in the billions. And the idea is to try and bridge that gap. It is not meant to replace the revenue. I don't want you to misconstrue that. It's not meant to replace the revenue. It is meant to help bridge the gap until a better solution can be solved. Either the domestic industry can reinvent itself to find a lower opportunity cost, or we can come up with a better trade deal in order to find a gain from trade that would benefit our country. And so that is significant here. Notice the producer surplus would have been from PA down to the supply curve. With the world price, it's just this little triangle below A there, much smaller. But with the producer surplus increased with the tariff, it goes all the way up to PT. So producer surplus is going to include PT all the way down to the supply curve. And then, as we said, B&E or deadweight loss, because of the higher price, fewer people are going to demand and supply those products, and so those products don't get made. And that's essentially the difference here in terms of the impact on the market based on these tariffs that are being imposed. Okay, so the next step then is that's kind of closes the gap on tariffs. You might need to take a break here, and if you do, take 60 seconds, grab some water, and then let's talk about quotas, because quotas are kind of the other model, if you will. We've got tariffs and taxes, but then we've also got quotas or quantity controls, and these are legal limits that are placed on the number of products that are coming into the United States. Now, just historical perspective, in the 70s, a lot of the Carter administration proposed quotas on cars coming in from Japan. Think Toyota and the limits of those cars. That had an impact on the market, much like a quota, quantity control, in order to help bridge the gap for the big three automakers here in the United States. And the reason for that quota was to give them time to, again, not to bridge the gap and bring us back to equilibrium at autarky, but to bridge the gap and give them time to reinvent themselves and find areas where they could make products at a lower opportunity cost and trade with other countries, just as they were trading with us. And so a quota looks very similar to what we saw in Key Graph 18. The difference here is that instead of C&D being government revenue, this time it is actually money that is going back to the country of origin. So the money is not staying in the country, which is significant. And this was kind of a lot of economists said, this is why you go with a tariff, not with a quota, because with placing limits and raising prices on the products coming in, there's no tariff to spread around as a subsidy to industries within the country. So you can't give farmers those billions of dollars we talked about with the tariff. In a quota, the money goes back to the country of origin because their price is higher. There's only so much that can come in, and they're getting that higher price. This is where it doesn't benefit the country that is placing the quota on the products coming in. It really is benefiting the country that's doing the exporting and disadvantages the country doing the importing. So let's delve a little deeper into that piece by looking at this model. So you may notice here from the demand curve all the way down from the demand curve. Original equilibrium at autarky was at price at autarky. So the yellow part would have been the producer surplus. The purple would have been the yellow part would have been the consumer surplus, and the purple part would have been the producer surplus. But notice here we have a world price, and that increases consumer surplus significantly and reduces producer surplus also significantly. And so they've imposed a quota, a limitation on the number of products coming in, and that price is reflected in PT. Now notice the domestic demand is smaller than it was at the world price, but the domestic supply is higher than it was at the world price. And the gap, still a gap, between what is demanded domestically and what is supplied domestically is essentially bridged with that quota, those products being imported from other countries. And so, again, B&E still deadweight loss, and C&D become the quota rent, if you will, if you remember that. The quota rent, essentially the money that the producer gets, and that goes back to the country that produced the product. So there's no benefit to any cottage industries or any local industries within your country to get any of that extra quota, that price at the PT. And that's the downside. That's the downside to a quota, which is why a tariff is probably a better way to go, because at least you can take that that money that is coming in from the tariff, and you can give it to the industries as a subsidy that are being impacted negatively by that tariff being imposed, much like President Trump did with the farmers that were trying to sell wheat and soybeans and things to countries like China, that where they were canceling the contracts, and here they are sitting on billions of dollars of farm products that are rotting in the silos, and at least they're getting something to help subsidize that gap. But with a quota, you'd get nothing. There'd be no revenue for the government to give, other than if they were to find other revenue somewhere else in the budget, which is totally another conversation for another class, right? So there is key graph 19. Again, pause here if you need to, and then we'll come back and wrap it up. All right, so there's a lot of conflict, and if you will, about trade protections being in place. Obviously, quotas and tariffs are some of those. Some of this is about creating jobs and creating industries within the home country. How can we protect ourselves? We know that a world of autarky is probably not realistic. We buy too many things from other countries. We use those products, and we continue to use them up, and then need more of them. And even with things as simple as the computer technologies and AI and all of the other resources that we have out there today, we need a lot of the products that other countries are making to put into those end products that we're selling on the national and international stage. So trade protection is one of those ways to minimize the deadweight loss, but is also meant to help the home country. Okay, there are a lot of organizations, and the World Trade Organization is one that are really trying to tackle this, trying to get more free trade out there. It's kind of a 3 steps forward and 2 back in a lot of cases, what we've seen, in the last, 20, 30 years. There's a lot of back and forth on that one. But the idea is the same. They're trying to find lower opportunity costs and comparative advantages for countries to be able to participate and gain from the trades that are out there. And I think that's really the important piece, what the WTO tries to do. Tariffs obviously have been declining. Now we know, this is from Krugman, but we know recently in the Trump's second administration, as well as in the first, that tariffs, even during the Biden administration didn't get rid of a lot of the tariffs that Trump had imposed on products from China. So those tariffs are higher than what you see here from the book. But up to that point, after the Great Depression and World War II, we saw a huge decline in tariffs being used in that capacity. We are seeing them being used with mixed success. And again, let economists do that. Our job here is to look at the data in terms of what is out there and what's being covered. There is a trade deficit, and we have heard that, I think the numbers just came out on Friday, that the trade deficit is up again. That trade deficit with other countries like China that are trying to address this. And what do we do? So tariffs may be working to help decrease that trade deficit, but the idea is it is still there. Okay, and so there is a lot of discussion and debate on free trade, the back and forth in terms of how do we do this and what do we do with free trade. But the idea is the same. We want to find ways that benefit our home industries, that are employing people, that are creating jobs, which is helping the circular flow of the economy, and using those resources to make goods and services that are then sold on the national and international stage for the benefit of all and for the benefit of our country. When we look at a lot of the production that is happening here, we may see a lot of things. And we want to talk about those things in terms of the trade debate. So you may remember that there is a lot of changes in supply and demand. And remember that the double shift rule is that if supply and demand are both changing, then something's going to be indeterminate, right? And we see that in this model. When supply and demand both move rightward outward, the indeterminate or ambiguous factor is price. It could be up, it could be down, it could be exactly the same. There could be no change at all. And so when both are moving in one direction, we see that it is price that is indeterminate. So that's important. When in doubt, graph it out. The whole idea here is to draw it, graph it. Even a little graph off to the side of a question on a quiz or a test is going to be helpful to you in terms of addressing those shifts in supply and demand. There's lots of other factors to take into consideration here, but I hope you will find those resources helpful. There are a number of explainers in this chapter that I encourage you to check out. If you go to the slides and click on any of these pictures that you see here, these are links, and these hyperlinks can take you to other places in the, if you can see there, some of the links that they're able to take you to. And I've got explainers on international trade, one's on comparative advantage if you need to check that out again, if you need another refresher, as well as terms of trade, the importance of that terms of trade and the benefits to that trade. And that should help you in this chapter as we wrap it up on international trade. We will take it up there and then get you ready for the Unit 1 quiz, and then off and running into Unit 2 and aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and introducing that as well. Again, check out the slides. These are the answers to the multiple choice questions, and I definitely encourage you to check those out. But definitely try them first, then check your work. I always try to put these in the back of the slides, so that way you can take a look at them in case you have any questions. I hope you found this to be helpful. This is Mr. Rodman signing off from Chapter 18 on international trade. Live that 5.